Well, thank you for coming. I'm quite excited and proud to have this chance to present my first research here at Mason. And I hope to engage you into the discussion at the end of this talk because as I was just talking to Peter, I'm coming to the end of this research and I still have no idea what Europe is. As an Ottoman historian who spent half of his life in Ottoman history, I have some idea what the Ottoman identity was. But as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about what Europe and being an Ottoman, what European and being an Ottoman meant, and how these two identities, perceptions, enabled the other to perceive themselves the way they perceived themselves. Now, throughout my talk, I will use Ottoman and Europe, but not in a definite sense. So please take these terms as very loose conceptions, not as well-established identities based on territorial boundaries. And I would even suggest that when I talk about the Ottomans versus Europe or vice versa, I might even simply refer to a group of peoples across the aisle, using the Senate metaphor. So Europeans are just on the western side of the aisle, and the Ottomans are on the eastern side of the aisle, in terms of how they conceived of themselves and how that very perception was determined by the other is the very subject of this talk. That said, I'm not going to so much focus on the chronology of a series of intellectuals writing about the other. My main purpose is to find out and to talk about the very reason why these intellectuals, statesmen, and geographers, scientists, philosophers came to the way they thought about the other. So instead of going through all these well-known cliches about the Ottomans in European thought or vice versa, I'll talk about why they come to think that way. That's the whole purpose of my talk. So I'll give you a fair number of examples of those perceptions too. But my purpose is why it happened at a particular historical time. We know that the Ottomans and Europe, mainly the people across the aisles, had increasing amount of context and relationship from 15th century onwards. Before that, there is really not much on either side about the other. And we see that, to the surprise of a modern reader, the initial perceptions, especially on European side, was quite positive, and that positive strain of thought continued to the very end. So it's very wrong to assume that from the first contact to today, there was always a negative view of the Ottomans among European intelligentsia. That was wrong. A number of very high-profile humanists during the Renaissance and then Enlightenment philosophers, etc., many of them wrote very positive. Of course, that positive may need to be qualified as well. But they didn't necessarily consider the Ottomans as their negative other. First of all, these Italian humanists at the turn of the 16th century just discovered and were quite excited to point the Ottomans for being Trojans. So, of course, that could be very understood within the European religious conflicts between the Catholics and the Orthodox. So Trojans who defeated, Trojans now were defeating the Byzantines, the Greeks. So they were almost hailed, and there were all sorts of prophecies among European cities, most notably in Italy, that the Ottomans were in fact on their way to become Christians and in fact save Europe from their divided status. And then that idea was gradually abandoned, and many historians tried to identify the Ottomans with the ancient Scythian people. So the first effort was to give the Ottomans some ethnic attribute, some ethnic identity. So it wasn't religion that defined that discourse initially, although it was there. As the Enlightenment unfolded, we see a whole different kind of discourse dominated European understanding of perception of the Ottomans, and especially from that period onwards through the 19th century I'll be talking about. Now, in the 16th century, along with those first contexts, in my analysis, a profound development took place which had enormous impact on the way people perceived the other as well as themselves. And that was the cartographic imagination, or one's placement of the self on the earth and subsequently attributing some meaning, some significance, some coherence to that existence along with that territory. So that came to be playing a much more significant role along the way, which overshadowed the religious cliches of earlier centuries. And that, coupled with the Enlightenment emphasis on rationality, on science, on culture, and civilization. So 19th century perceptions were dominated by a discourse on civilization. But at the foundation of that civilizational discourse was geographical imageries and even geographic determinism. So I will just go ahead and show some examples of that, how that those geographic imageries impacted. So I'll start out with Europeans. Beforehand, we know that the Ottomans and European geographers and cartographers had a great deal in common because it was one of the areas where you naturally have more contact. You wouldn't have a lot of exchanges in theological scholarship, literature, but through trade networks and exchanges, corsairs, captives, renegades, geographical knowledge was one of the fastest disseminating areas in early modern history. As you know, the Piri Reis map of the world is the first depiction of Americas. It was dated from 1513, and he says he used Columbus maps. So it's very early. So almost instantly, they were aware of cartographic developments elsewhere. However, in traditional Ottoman cartography, they placed themselves in the world in a system of climes, not continents. That was traditional Islamic cartography, which goes back to Mesopotamian traditions ultimately, and which made use of Ptolemaic imageries of the world. In short, they divided the world into 7 climes and accorded themselves within one of those climes. Apart from that, Muslim geographers also created a number of what they called customary climes, which they mean regions across the earth, and they attributed certain coherence, cultural, ethnic, characteristic coherence to those regions. To give some examples, Misr, for example, was a region. It wasn't a country. A region which has certain characteristics, not only physical, but also human characteristics. Khorasan was a region. Yemen was a region, etc. So some, depending on the geographer, they might have up to 30, 40 different regions across the world. And they, of course, as the Ottomans, they placed themselves within one of those, several of those customary regions. And that worked for Ottoman imagination very well, especially in the 16th century, because that accorded the Ottomans sort of coherence. Because when you look at the Ottoman map, you are looking at a very wide and very varying types of territories, a very versatile human geography. So attributing that geography a cosmic coherence on the basis of the understanding of the system of climes worked very well for the Ottomans. And the Ottomans, the Ottoman geographers or cartographers never thought of themselves primarily part of any big land mass. Land was not part of their identity. However, climes were. And it became a significant part of even the Sultanic regalia and how the Ottoman elite, in fact, defined themselves. In more elaborate expositions, the Sultan would enumerate up to 40 different of those customary climes that he was ruling over. And that gave the Ottoman Empire coherence. However, during the beginning of the 16th century, what became the norm in European cartography was the continent-based depiction of the world. So now we have Europe, Asia, Africa, and others. So all of a sudden, you come across with the European depiction of Ottoman Empire in maps, and you instantly see that it was a divided empire with no coherence. And one of the standard ways of depicting that was Turkey in Europe, Turkey in Asia, Turkey in Africa. Even in later centuries, when the Ottomans adopted this as a new geography or cartography, they slightly changed it. They rather called it Ottoman Europe, Ottoman Asia, Ottoman Africa. Even that suggests a totally different ways of perception. And this map is an example of the early generation of Ottoman depictions, and there the map makers, of course, had different objectives and interests in their mind. They were not made for school atlases at the time. The early generation of atlases were very careful in depicting what is important, especially for their historical knowledge and religious identities. For example, in those maps, they would mark mostly religious sites, Christian sites, and historical names. So even if you see a map of the Ottoman Empire emanating from Venice or Amsterdam in the 17th century, you would mostly see cities in ancient names. So you could see, for example, Lydia or Philadelphia. You won't see Istanbul, Ankara, Antalya in any of these maps until very, very late in the 19th century. And this kind of depiction is very rare, but at the same time reflects the European cartographic perception of the Ottoman Empire. In the main, they didn't pay any attention to the administrative divisions of the Ottoman Empire. As I said, most place names were taken from antiquity. This one fairly well represents the Ottoman administrative divisions, yet it's very obvious that the Turkish Empire in Europe, Asia, and Africa. I would like to take your attention also to the very name Turkish Empire. Never, almost never, in those maps use the term Ottoman. So from the Ottoman perspective, Turkish didn't mean anything, pretty much. It wasn't part of their political identity. It wasn't part of their official communication at no point until very, very late in the 19th century, at the time of the Young Turks. So Turkishness was not part of Ottoman self-identification. In fact, for a very long time, up until 19th century, the Ottoman Empire did not have a very definite, exclusive political identity, yet alone Turkishness. But from European window, it was always a Turkish empire, and at times it was the empire of the Grand Signior. So it wasn't an empire such as the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't have an inherent existence as a state. It was either the empire of Turks or the Grand Signior. Only the very, very careful European cartographers at times may mention Ottoman in their legends. Now, I would like to give a few examples as to how that came about and unfolded, and what consequences it created in terms of Europeans' perception of the Ottoman Empire. One was the increasing depiction or understanding of the Ottoman Empire as an alien existence on European soil. Because with the Enlightenment, we also see that the very idea of Europe was gaining ground. It was a very nascent idea. The concept, the term was there since at least ancient Greece. We have some references in Herodotus or Hippocrates, but they don't really accord Europe a sweeping and exclusive cultural or territorial identity yet. For Hippocrates, for example, when he talks about the barbarians, the Persians were barbarians as much as the Western peoples, west of Greece were barbarians. So when he talks about Europe, and that Europe also included by the Asian Minor. So the continental definitions of Europe was always in conflict with what Europe meant as a human and cultural geography. To the very end, we know that Eastern Europe was not easily admitted into that European conceptualization, not because Eastern Europe was ruled by the Ottomans, but for other reasons as well. Throughout the 17th century and even 18th century, we see a number of European travelers. When they landed in Budapest or Belgrade, they started to title their travelogues as Orient. So when they, as soon as, in fact, one Austrian politician, I forget his name, could be Metternich, he says, the Orient starts in Ringstrasse. So Ringstrasse is the outermost street in Vienna. So many Europeans actually felt that they were in the Orient when they exited what they thought Europe at the time. So it wasn't only about Ottoman Empire. So Europe's expansion in terms of cultural entity was in the making, and I think it's still in the making, and it will be in the making, because these constructs, at least in the early modern period, were continually redefined or deconstructed and reconstructed, and it's a process still going on. And Cold War historians would point better that it was hardly, Eastern Europe was hardly part of Europe at the time, although nowadays Europe is given a much broader sense. So one was the exclusion of the Ottoman Empire from Europe at conceptual level. So the Ottomans were increasingly considered as part of Asia and not continental Europe, and that what gave way to that conceptualization was Montesquieu, who had a profound impact on later perceptions of the Ottoman Empire. He reinvented the Ptolemaic understanding of human geography. As you may remember, Ptolemy attributed certain characteristics to geography. So depending on the climatic features of a given terrain, people would have certain characteristics. So that became the foundation of Europe's perception of others. So what they thought was, well, the Ottomans, the Turks, were of Asia, and Asian climate would give people a certain set of characteristics, which is all negative, we know, but we don't need to go into that. And European climate was different. Therefore, that climate gave Europeans a certain characters, and that, in fact, played an important role in the way Europeans justified the idea of progress, because Europeans, because of their geography, had certain characteristics, and thanks to those characteristics, they were able to progress, invent. They were rational, for example, thanks to their climate. The Asians could not be rational, even if they wanted, because they're more sentimental, emotional, servile, etc. So that created a conflict here, because now Asiatic people were ruling part of Europe. So that was expressed in the Enlightenment's language of reason and science, because now it attributed that notion a scientific certainty. It couldn't be otherwise, and that was an anomaly. So Asiatic people could not and should not rule part of Europe. So they should be driven back to their country, and that constituted the very intellectual basis of the Eastern question of the 19th century. And if you were living in the 19th century, we would sleep and wake up with the Eastern question. And I come across with a bibliography published towards the end of 19th century, and that bibliography alone gives 2,000 books in the English language written on the Eastern question in the 19th century alone. So it was one of the most captivating questions, and at the heart of that question was whether the Turks belonged to Europe or not. At that juncture, again, thanks to Enlightenment thought, that conflict or antagonism was expressed in the language of civilization. So it became a lot more secular as time passed. The Christian perceptions of the Ottomans always remained there from the very beginning, but the civilizational conception now accommodated that, because the very Christianity was also considered to be a product of a superior race, thanks to their geographical location. And Islam was an inferior religion because it was emanated from a terrain which is inherently could not produce superior cultural elements. So in that 19th century context, what played a role in sort of a turning point was the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which was initially conceived to be a balance of power arrangement, but turned out to be a lot bigger than its original conception. So it was, after Napoleonic invasions, created a sort of ensured existing boundaries among European states to prevent future conflicts and such sweeping invasions. And the Ottoman Empire was not included, despite the fact that one of the strongest members of the concert, Austria, backed the Ottomans. And strangely, in the 19th century, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans liked each other a lot because they felt the same threat, because they were both multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires. And there's a very close relationship between the two. Nevertheless, others refused to accept the Ottoman Empire, and the Concert of Europe was founded, and immediately it was expressed in the language of civilization. So it wasn't only a European concert, but also a concert of civilized nations. And that also created the problem of whether the Ottomans were a nation in the first place. But that's also the time when, in the wake of French Revolution, European states were expressing themselves more and more in the language of a single nation, attributing more coherence to their statehood. And of course, one of the biggest and most widespread criticisms after that was that the Ottomans were not a nation at all. And that continued to the very end. Even Toynbee, the great historian, writing in the service of British war propaganda in 1917, justified his whole treatise, pamphlet, on that notion that the Ottomans did not constitute a nation, therefore has no legitimate place in the family of nations. Yet alone it wasn't a civilized entity. But for the Ottomans, it became sort of a red apple. So it prompted the Ottomans that they should now be part of that entity, because it is a concert of civilized nations. Now, I will, before going into what the 19th century Ottoman intellectuals and statesmen thought, I would like to give you a few pre-19th century examples of European Ottoman self-perceptions vis-a-vis Europe. Now, I said that the Ottomans primarily consider of themselves in terms of climes, not continents. But they learned that instantly, and they instantly realized that that's something to tackle with. So it was almost traumatic for Ottoman perception, because all of a sudden they see three different entities based on European cartography. So many tried to justify that. In the 16th century, in a an Ottoman astronomer al-Muwakkil, for example, relocates, tries to relocate the Ottoman Empire or parts of it in different climes, which corresponds to Europe, to make it more compatible with the continental division of the world. So he says Constantinople is part of the fifth climb, which was where most of continental Europe was located. Again, historian Mustafa Ali says, he tries to create again a climb, whose consular climbs are customer by nature, and we could define them. He defines a climb which includes Spain. Of course, his justification was Spain was once a Muslim territory. Therefore, he puts Spain and Ottoman Empire, including all of Ottoman possessions, here with the same climb, which makes the Ottomans inseparable from Europe. And we also see in the 17th century, Katip Çelebi, who got engaged with European thought in a much deeper way. He, in fact, taught himself Latin and translated a number of works from Latin. He also wrote a few colossal books of geography. And one of those books, he tries to reconcile the continental cartography with the system of climes. He recognizes and actually accepts that it is the right way to depict the world, perhaps. However, he then tries to accommodate the continental division within the system of climes by locating the whole region within one climb and making distinctions between the Ottoman possessions here and the Christian possessions in the West. So his idea of a climb was mostly based on religious coherence. So he maintains that these areas were not part of the physical Europe. So his perception of Europe was, as he defines it, quote unquote, the seat of Christian kings. It wasn't a territorial region. However, those conceptions did not hold up. And many other geographers, even after Katip Çelebi, tried to grappled with this discrepancy, and some even went so far as considering in totality the Ottoman Empire as part of an undefined Europe. One geographer from late 16th century, for example, praises Europe, however he doesn't define, for producing such great rulers as Süleyman the Magnificent. And Süleyman the Magnificent comes in a line of great rulers. One was Alexander the Great, and then Süleyman, and that was the characteristic of Europe, always produces such great rulers. So in that, in the mind of that particular geographer, there was no distinction between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. However, he doesn't define, or he avoids defining Europe. In terms of the particular self-definitions and perceptions of the Ottomans themselves, unlike what is often depicted in European scholarship, it wasn't, as I pointed, the Turkish identity. Rather, the Ottoman imperial elite, first of all, ethnically was very composite, and in most likelihood, the ethnically Turkish element was always in the minority in Ottoman unity. They always tended to display themselves and express as Rumis. And Rumi means, in Ottoman parlance, literally it means Romans. Of course, they didn't mean to be Romans, because since Turkic peoples first arrived in Asia Minor, they were called the Muslims of the land of the Romans. From that, early perceptions by other Muslims, they came to be simply known as Rumis, namely people of the land of the former Roman Empire. Now, more specifically, they refer Rumelia, the land of Rumis, to the Balkans. However, that came to be their most shared and bragged about identity. An Ottoman governor, even in Egypt or Yemen or Abyssinia, would confidently and braggingly call themselves Rumi, and they were known as Rumis anyway in Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere. So that was part of your Ottoman self-distinction, and that culturally and geographically included and was inseparable from what later came to be Europe. So in the 19th century, especially when the Ottoman statesmen and intellectuals got in increasing diplomatic contacts with Europeans, and when they told them that they were not Europeans, that's really created a traumatic reconceptualization of their identities, because they were comfortably saw themselves as Rumis. In fact, demographically speaking, for most of Ottoman history, to the very end, the bulk of Ottoman ruling elite always came from the Balkans. Even the founders of modern Turkey, most of them, including Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, they were all born and raised in Balkan provinces. So it was quite a novelty for them to rethink that now they were not Europeans. However, it wasn't that simple, of course. In the 19th century, there was enormous amount of writings in the media as well as in the press about the Ottomans, the Orient, what it means to be European or Asiatic, and under the near monopoly of writings on such topics, the Ottoman intellectuals, most of them, came to think or admit European perceptions. One good example is the Orient, because one categorical depiction in European intelligentsia was Orient. As I said, Orient, well, most of them started from Europe. Nevertheless, that very attribution of being an Oriental was mostly as a defense came to define most Asian intellectuals. We see, for example, some Ottoman intellectuals. One good example is Rashid Ibrahim, who went to Japan, had in close contacts with black dragomans there. He traveled to India and tried to inculcate a common Oriental identity. So, because Europeans were telling them that they were categorically different than the Europeans, and they all have certain similar characteristics, that, of course, along with colonialism, drew closer those intellectuals, and sort of they accepted the Oriental identity. And many of them started to talk about making a distinction between what it meant to be European and Oriental, despite the fact that they were still considering themselves part of that physical Europe. And that, of course, was also part of the 19th century political competition among the great powers. So the Ottomans tried to, despite all this identity crisis, attribute the empire a new coherence, and they, many of them desperately, actually, tried to, preferred not to see what was considered to be a geographical reality at the time, and tried to redefine the empire. I'll give you one example from a military cartographer around the turn of the century. Quote, he says, although the Ottoman Empire of the three continents appears to consist of three distinct lands that are known as Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Asia and Ottoman Africa in reality is a single continent, because the three continents are divided by the Bosphorus, the Marmara Sea, the islands, and the Suez Canal. The Bosphorus is as narrow as may be called a thin river, being built artificially. The Suez Canal is like a large creek. The Aegean Sea, although wide, contains many close islands, and the Marmara Sea is tiny. Because these cannot be considered to form a divide that separates the Rumelia from Anatolia, the Ottoman lands could be seen as a single continent. So that they tried to see the empire that way. So here, he doesn't consider these markings as legitimate to divide these land masses into continents. He says this is a river, this is not a sea, and this is a man-made canal. It doesn't count, therefore this is one land mass, and argues that it's a continent, and he might be quite sympathized by modern geographers, many who are criticizing the division of the earth into continents. So, on the other hand, some Ottomans also found that quite to their benefit, because especially the dynastic apologetics. Now, they like the idea of depicting the Ottoman Empire in the same vein as the British Empire. Like now, the Ottoman Empire is the empire of three continents. So that gave more pomp to their self-identity at the time. Now, in conclusion, the main difference between all these varying conceptions of the other, or self-perceptions, was not primarily religious or political or even cultural. The very rise of modern cartography, which depicted the Earth in terms of three continents, created the basis of what it meant to be a European. Without delineating the continent, the idea of Europe was very vague. It was an undefined, abstract Europe. The very Ottomanness, in return, was also very vague, and it wasn't even an integral part of Ottoman identity to the very end. Only in the latter half of the 19th century, in response, Ottoman intellectuals tried to fill the content of Ottomanism. They tried to attribute some binding principles or coherence to geography in terms of its culture, history, peoples, etc. And the change was drastic, especially seen in these maps, which I will show you a few more. This is what the Ottomans were accustomed with until the end of 15th century. This was the Ottomans' world view. Now, of course, it's from modern eye upside down. It has to be, because medieval Muslim maps were always south at the top. Here you could see, here's Mecca. All medieval Muslim world maps put Mecca at the center of the world because it's artificial. You can put the center anywhere you want. And this map, particular map, was made circa 1474 at the court of Mehmed II, who also thought of giving his own empire a central place or a bigger place on Earth. Here, the whole Europe is this corner, and this is the Ottoman territories at the time, and this is the Mediterranean Sea. This is the ocean, and here the information given is even more interesting. Here it says for the Asian population, the Asian side of the Ottoman Empire, it says Bilad Rum, which means the land of Rum, land of Rumis. And here it says, it doesn't say Europe. He said a large tract of land from the land of Rum. So there is absolutely no distinction between Europe and the Asian part of the Ottoman Empire. So in Mehmed II's mind, his empire occupies this part of the world, and Mecca is at the center. So just imagine the pictorial, or imagine a shift when they see a continent-based empire. Now, I'm jumping from the very beginning to the very end in this map. Here, one way of coping with that divided depiction of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was to come up with an Ottoman map without showing the others and without not marking the continental boundaries, showing the Ottoman Empire as one entity. On the European side, I would like to end up with two maps as to how the idea of Europe vis-a-vis Ottoman Empire or Asia was still quite fluid. This is a map from a very late time, from 1912. And the colored section is Europe in this map. And as you could see, Caucasia is included in continental Europe. And even more interesting is that modern Turkey's boundaries is today here. So today's easternmost Turkish cities at this time was considered part of Europe because at the time they were under Russian occupation, part of Russia. That's why they were considered Europe. And this is a map of the Eastern question. And this is even more interesting, coming from a German atlas, because it first of all shows how dominant the Eastern question became in pursuing the Ottoman Empire. But even beyond that, the very question attributes itself a definite geography. Now, in this atlas, the only depiction of the Ottoman Empire was given is this. So you have a few pages for each country, but there's no entry for the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was meaningful, interesting only as part of the Eastern question and this historical mass as to how this went and how the Ottomans retreated from European soil. I would like to stop here and thank you for your patience, and the floor is open for questions. Thank you very much.